writer. She's, one of those journalists that was tired of seeing all of the negativity in the news, so she did something about it, and she founded Storytellers for Good. Storytellers for Good works to expose the great stories that individuals and organizations have. So I'll turn it over to you without much.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Hi, good afternoon. Really excited to be here. Talking about storytelling is one of my great passions. I'd love to start with just 2 or 3 of you sharing some of your greatest storytelling challenges. Any volunteers? Yes.
So my organization is called Year Reveal, and I'm trying to figure out how to tell narratives about our clients on Twitter and 140 characters. It's ridiculously hard to try to convert just these beautiful stories into short little pieces in mass format.
Great point. Brevity in this technology creates culture we live in. Yes.
I find it really challenging to preface the problem or challenge that we're trying to address without being really depressing to people, while at the same time still conveying the weight of the issue that we're trying to address.
Great point. Yes.
Actually, our organization manages service data. We are a nonprofit takes care of human service. It's very hard for us to, say what exactly we do. We say we do data. Oh, you're a tech company. No, exactly like for-profit tech company. It's really hard. So that's very important.
Helping people understand why you do what you do, right? Yes, one more.
So I work with different companies, and they have employees that are located, internationally and nationally. So I find it challenging to how do we encourage and empower employees to also take up the charge and tell stories, to each other in the same business units, outside of their business units, and giving them that empowerment to do that.
Okay. All right, well, I'm going to do my best to try to touch at least a little bit on all these points, and many more. So I'm going to just start with a quote from Maya Angelou, which is kind of one that we live by at Storytellers for Good, which is that people will forget what you said, they'll forget what you did, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. And if you remember nothing else today, I hope that this quote sticks with you. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the media landscape that we're living in, focus most of our time going through 4 very basic principles that you already know about storytelling. And I'm just going to remind you of what you already know. And my hope is that whether you are trying to produce videos, writing grants, doing a radio podcast of some sort, that these principles will serve as guideposts for you as you try to navigate the world of story. And little disclaimer, I do work in the world of video, so some of my examples tend to be skewed a little bit that way, but I just want to remind you that these principles are very relevant to all different mediums. And then we'll talk a little bit about storytelling in fundraising, because many of us in the nonprofit space are concerned about that. So, anyone remember when television looked like this? So my grandmother had one of these, and there was a time when there were 3 stations that you could watch on a television that looked like this. And now we're living in a very different era where we're bombarded with hundreds of TV stations, which of course is that getting information off the internet is like taking a drink from a fire hydrant. Let's put it that way. So while there's that challenge, there is also a unique opportunity through our websites and social media channels. We have the ability to share our voice. And my belief is that stories have such a unique ability to cut through all of the noise that's out there. So Robert McKee says that stories are the creative conversation of life into a more powerful, clearer, more meaningful experience. They're the currency of human contact. You'll see that I like a lot of quotes in this presentation, if you don't mind. So a very quick exercise. I'm going to invite you to turn to the person next to you, and in about 90 seconds, I'll tell you when to switch. Share a memorable story. And I'm only going to give you 4 categories to choose from. Some of these stories could go all over the place. So it could be a travel story, a sibling rivalry story. You know, maybe you had 10 kids in one bathroom growing up. An embarrassing moment story, you're human, you have one. Or a pet story. Maybe you had some unique turtle that you were raised with or something. I've heard all kinds. So find a partner and just take the first 90 seconds, partner number 1, to find that story and tell it.
Well, wait,
So storytelling is courageous work, and especially when it comes to telling one of your own stories. So I wanted to see if there was a brave volunteer who has a story in one of these categories that they could share in about 90 seconds. Brave volunteer. Courageous volunteer. All right. You wouldn't mind standing and addressing the room?
Sure. Okay.
All right.
From the table.
Oh, so on the table too? Too much, too soon. So my name is Isha Hammy. I work for Silicon Valley Community Foundation. So I chose a pet story. When I was little, I'm one of 3. So when I was little, my parents, they used to always be bombarded by all 3 of us. We want a pet, we want a pet, we want a pet. So my mom was like, okay, fine. I'll grab you this stray cat from the backyard. So she gave us this cat, and we took care of the cat. The cat came and went. So finally, I showed her that I could take care of an animal. So when I was 8 years old, she's like, okay, I'm going to get you a real cat from the shelter. You're going to have this cat under your responsibility. So we went down to the shelter. I picked out this cute little white puffy cat. She had a little black spot in the middle of her forehead. I named her Puffy. She was great. She was my best friend. I loved her to death. All of a sudden, a few months later, Puffy started to not love me as much. And she started to scratch me all the time, no matter what I did. I pet her, I fed her, I promise I fed her. I fed her, I litter box, everything, but she started to attack me. And I tried to hide it from my parents for the longest time. But it didn't work out. And so one holiday, my cousin was visiting from Ohio, and this cat terrorized her to the point where she like stood on this bar stool and everything, and it was just a nightmare. So we went to sleep, woke up the next morning, my mom was like, randomly in the middle of the night, we had no idea what happened. And so I thought that my cat ran away for 10 years. When I was on my way to college, my mom was like, you ever asked me about Puppy? She didn't really run away. Your dad and I took her to the vet, and they had to put her to sleep. She actually had a chemical imbalance. And that was how I found out that cats can actually have chemical imbalances. Animals can actually have a chemical imbalance. But yeah, so she kept that secret from me for 10 years.
All the twists and turns in that story. I didn't know where it was going.
And I still have some scratches, actually. I showed Teresa.
All right. Well, in addition to getting you all to talk to one another, the reason behind that exercise is also to help you realize the power of story. So there's a sticky factor about stories such that, 5 years from now I might see you on the road and not remember exactly where I met you or what your name was, but I'll probably remember the fact that your parents stole your pet. So stories have this very sticky, very memorable type factor. So I'm going to tell you a quick story about my background. This is me when I was about 2 years old. I used to get into a lot of trouble. I had 4 brothers, and I was always very curious and looking into things. And I thought I was going to take that curiosity and become a lawyer one day. I had this random idea that I always wanted to be a TV news reporter. So I instead moved to Naples, Florida, which I had never heard of, and became that reporter. And reported on various sea turtle strandings and manatee findings, and got to interview D-level celebrities like this guy. I don't know if anyone remembers. Joe Millionaire. It was this horrible reality talk show, one of the earliest, pre-Bachelor, and I was clearly very excited to meet him. But eventually I made my way up and finally got to be that reporter at a big fancy station in Boston, and wore a lot of makeup, as you can see, and got to be that person out in the snowstorm telling everyone else to go home. But what I quickly realized about this big city news dream of mine fulfilled was that on any given day, I often found myself outside of crime scene tape and chasing after people in courtrooms, just like in the movies, and being in some really difficult situations. And I had one situation in particular where I had showed up at a house of a woman who had been killed in a car accident that morning, and her daughter came out as the news truck pulled up, and she said, "What happened to my mother?" And without me telling her, she had figured out before my eyes what had happened. And it was one of the worst days of my professional life. And the reason that I decided to leave this industry and follow the wisdom of a friend who gave me a Zen proverb which said, "Leap, and the net will appear." So I quit my job and bought a one-way ticket to Argentina and spent the next 10 months actually traveling through South America, India, and in the end finally came back to myself and to my love of story. And as I thought about what I wanted to do next, I thought about how alive I was when I told stories like one about this father-son team who run dozens of marathons together. This guy, Tony DeBloy, who's blind and autistic, but can play 27 instruments. And this young woman, Kai Harriet, who when she was 3 years old, was hit by a stray bullet and paralyzed for the rest of her life, but has the most positive attitude. So these are the stories that inspired me to start Storytellers for Good about 5 years ago. And we are now a team that works primarily with nonprofits and change makers to help them craft stories around the work that they do and create more impact as a result. So I'm going to dive right into the principles of storytelling. And before I do so, I wanted you to take a moment with the piece of paper that you have in front of you. And in the story section, I'd like you to just take a minute to think about a story that you want to tell. It could be your own story. It could be a story in your organization. Something that would help support your work with it. Everybody got one? Raise your hand if you need more time. Okay, a few more seconds. Bet you did that in 140 characters or less. Okay, so principle number 1, storytelling, offshoot of the Maya Angelou quote is to aim for the heart. I like to think of the heart as like a net. So people are constantly being thrown things at them. Information, that fire hydrant experience. If you can land something in the heart space, it just has the ability to stick like nothing else. Dan Greenberg talks about viral videos, that sharing feelings is a basic human need. If your videos capture an emotion that resonates with their audience, users will share it because they're not just sharing your content, they're sharing the feeling your video has created. We've all experienced this, right? You're on Facebook and you come across a video or some story that makes you laugh or cry. And what's your first instinct? You want to share it. Right. You want your friend to have that same experience. And then when they write back, LOL, or they write back that they had to get the Kleenex out, you just feel good about it. I did that yesterday, and I just, whew. I passed something along. So we're designed that way, to feel emotion and to share emotion. So I'm going to share a story that created in Kenya, actually, some years ago. And I'm going to show the story first, and then I'll talk a little bit about the process of telling it. It's called Mama Hope.
Hope is an action. I mean, it's a verb. It's what people do. Our approach really starts with the communities themselves. What we're trying to do is let the community have the vision to plant the seeds of hope. And that since we're all interconnected and we can help each other, we just should.
My dear sponsored son, Banana.
My mother had taken on Bernard as a sponsor and a son. They would send letters back and forth to each other.
Sending him all the nice wishes now and always. Love, Stephanie.
This is probably the last picture we took together, so it's difficult. Basically, she got sick and she had 4 stages of ovarian cancer and she passed away almost immediately. My mother was really my everything. I was an only child raised by a single mother, so when she died, it was like I lost my family.
I almost died. I was very sad. She had the heart to pay fee for someone she don't know. She only saw me on a photograph.
Just a couple weeks after she died, I got the opportunity to come to Kenya. We actually came to this park and we planted 2 trees here. What I came to find out is that my mother not only sponsored him, she also had sponsored this project that helped hundreds of women that were either living with HIV/AIDS or whose parents had died of HIV/AIDS.
She told me that, Anastasia, I've not told you this, I'm dying of cancer. I'm not making it. But I have a daughter, just one daughter, who will make sure that what I wanted to do for you, for the organization, and for the girls comes to fulfillment. So I waited for the girl.
I found hundreds of people waiting for me. And the minute I got out of the car, they broke into Amazing Grace, which was, well, I was saying, I'm a funeral. And I mean, I just started crying immediately. It was just an overwhelming experience in general. They said, your mother helped all these people and told me about the project, and I hadn't heard anything about this.
When I broke the news that she's the one who was replaced the mother died, everybody cried.
Grief is just love. That's really what it is. I was struggling with what do you do with that leftover love? It just became clear to me that I wanted to give that leftover love to these people. We have a health clinic up in Isiolo. We have a drip irrigation garden that's been built at a school in Mayu. We also have 2 water projects in the desert in Isiolo. The school in Tanzania is going to serve about 300 people, and 100 of them will be orphans from the community. The garden here in Kisumu is aimed at women who are caregivers so that they can bring people who are sick food or take care of orphans. So once they really understand the process, they can start to have gardens in their own homes.
I value it very highly. Yeah, it helps my family. Even right now, they are going to eat veggies with tomato inside.
In Jungle Tree, they learn the arts and crafts teach them how to make clothes or make jewelry to sell. And then it also teaches them how to run a business.
Everybody can be self-reliant. So long as you are dedicated, you can do your work, get your money, and life goes on.
They are telling the community that you are also able to do the same. We have given you the skills you need. Continue, sustain yourself.
I had a dream actually one day that Mama Hope had a hospital, and I was the only doctor working that place. And I know my dream will be a reality one day.
If you can take your grief and take that love and make something out of it, then you're really able to honor that person in a way that lets them live on.
So when we went to Kenya to tell that story, Nyla had a very different story in mind. She had been very adamant that we go out and interview all of the different community projects and talk to people who were impacted by their work. And we did that, and we met all these people, and they were amazing and inspiring. But in terms of the emotional heart of Mama Hope, I strongly felt that Nyla's story was it. And so through building trust, we were able to develop a relationship, and she trusted me with that story. So when it comes to emotion, similar to Nyla's story, this is something a guy named Simon Sinek has calls the golden circle. I like to think, I'll just explain, his philosophy is that people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. So when it comes to the emotional heart of the story, what you're essentially doing is helping people understand why you do what you do. So in the example of Mama Hope, if you just saw, the community projects, maybe you would relate. But once you understand that Mama Hope has this very deep personal story behind it, it opens you up a little bit, right? It opens you up not just to Nyla, but to Mama Hope as an organization. So when it comes to emotion, you want to think about what are the stories, or the elements of the stories that you want to tell that give your heart that zing feeling, that make you go, oh, or that make you laugh. Laughter is a really powerful form of emotion to convey through storytelling. So a question I often get asked is, well, how do you get emotion out of people? And so whether you're working in print or video or radio, we're often in situations where we're sitting down with someone and we're tasked to tell their story, their emotional story. So I'm going to share just a few things that I do in the process of doing that. So the first thing is I make really strong eye contact with people. So one thing that can happen when we're interviewers is that we, especially if we're new at it, we're asking somebody a question and they start talking, and as soon as they start talking, our mind goes to what we're going to ask next, right? Versus staying with what they're saying. And so I find that I take a deep breath, I clear my mind, and I really look into the person's eyes so that they know that I'm seeing them. And when people feel seen, they relax and they open. Something that happens in the interviewing process is that I like to create a lot of space. So again, as a new interviewer, sometimes there can be this sort of rapid fire approach to interviewing. It's like, well, tell me about this, and tell me about this, and tell me about this. And so the person's diligently answering the question, but there's not a lot of space. And especially when it comes to emotional content, usually people will give you a little bit, and they're not quite ready to give you that extra bit. But when you allow there to be that open space, people naturally feel it, right? So we've all been in conversations where there's just this dead space, right? And usually that dead space only lasts for a little bit of time before someone jumps in to fill it. And so what I often have to work with in this is sometimes my own discomfort with that silence, right? My own tendency to want to fill that space, to create that space for someone else to jump in there. Ask tough questions, and sometimes ask them again. This is something I had to do over and over again, especially in dealing with emotional content. I had an experience in Nicaragua a few years ago where I was doing a story about this wonderful nonprofit, Project Grace, that takes people who've lost loved ones, and they do community service work for a week, and it's a healing and service type project. And one of the women whom we planned to build a story around had lost her daughter in a motorcycle accident about 4 months prior to this event. And she gave the most heartfelt, emotional interview. And at one point, I looked back at my brother, actually, who's the videographer on this project, and he looked like a ghost. And he said that something happened to the camera, and the whole interview was lost because of the heat. And so, you know, oftentimes when it comes to these interviews, the people who are there with us have trusted us, right, to tell their story. And so this woman, you know, despite that circumstance, she was still trusting me. And she's like, okay, you gotta ask me again. And I think in some ways it was more difficult for me to ask than it was for her to re-answer. And she, again, gave another beautiful interview. But you know, whether it's a unique circumstance like that or a more likely scenario where you know you're inviting someone to share some emotion and they might be a little hesitant, sometimes you have to probe a little bit deper and keep asking those tough questions, even if you yourself are made slightly uncomfortable by that question. This is a point relevant to video or radio. Sometimes when people know that they're being recorded, they tend to clam up. And so when the interview is technically done, we'll sort of announce that. I'll say, oh, thank you, I think we got what we needed today. But I have an agreement with the videographer that you can maybe start to tear some things down, the lights or whatever else out around us. But oftentimes when people feel like there's not a formal interview happening, they are more likely to be themselves, they're more likely to open up, and some of the best elements of interviews that I've gotten have come after the official interview. And then the last thing is just a level of openness. You know, there's something in the news industry we used to call producer fantasia, which is the idea that producers have ideas of what the story should be, and it should have all these elements of, you know, all these amazing visuals, and then oftentimes you arrive at the story and it's nothing what you thought. So I have a lot of experience of working with stories that didn't pan out as I planned or expected. And a lot of the nonprofit clients I work with sometimes are very adamant about, you know, this is the story. And then I'll go and interview the client, and in fact, it's actually a different story. And so really, as you're interviewing, being open to what you find, and building a very authentic story around that versus what you want to find. Because it can be very subtle, but when a story is not authentic, when it's kind of forced, it can be felt by the audience. And then a few tips, whether you're shooting stills or video, in conveying emotion, is to think about the close-ups. So I like to think of close-ups and aiming tight, as I call it, as a way of exaggerating what's there to give a felt sense for someone who's not there of what it was like to be there. So in our video work, we do a lot of close-up work. You know, this is a young 6-year-old girl who was about to do this amazing act of kindness for a group of police officers, and she had this look of anticipation in her eye leading up to that we were able to capture. When it comes to another kind of aim-tight detail is to, if you're, again, recording anything, to notice the sounds. And even if you're writing, actually, you know, creating that sensory experience for someone, what it sounded like to be there. So, you know, a Habitat for Humanity type story, you know, you're getting the hammers, you're getting all of the noise that's happening, and putting that into your story so people get that felt sense. You know, we've all experienced that. You watch NPR, This American Life, you know, all the natural sounds that are woven into the story to help someone have that felt sense of being there. And then the last thing is just looking for the little details that make someone really unique or stand out. So this was a shot that we had in a story about a woman who was being helped by an agency that helped the elderly with social activities and educational programs. And the woman who we were profiling had lost her husband about 7 years ago. And the detail that I noticed as I was shooting the story was that she was still wearing her wedding ring, you know, 7 years later. So little details like that can really help accentuate and create more of a felt sense of your story. Another example of that is just, you might notice in some of our examples, I really like feet shots. I think you can tell a lot about a person by the way that they walk. Sometimes the shoes that they wear, and it's very subtle, but again, it helps give that felt sense. So in the print world, I like to think of showing versus telling. So again, thinking about the sensory details that can put someone in an experience if they are not there in the moment. So, rather than saying, like an example of telling would be, she was disappointed as she drove home. An example of showing was as she drove home with her hands clutching the steering wheel. She could barely see the road ahead of her because the tears were just pouring so fast. Something like that gives more felt sense details. So take a moment on your worksheet there. You've highlighted a possible story that you can tell. What do you want people to feel? And more importantly, what are the aspects of that story that convey emotion, that help your audience feel what you want them to feel? Take about a minute or so. Okay, so we're going to move on to principle number 2, and that is let characters lead. So John Steinbeck says if a story is not about the hearer, he will not listen. And here I make a rule: a great and interesting story is about everyone, or it will not last. The idea here is that we're all essentially looking to see ourselves in the stories that we listen to. And oftentimes in the nonprofit world, change maker world, we're all dealing with large populations of people that we're serving, lives we're changing, and we're tempted to tell all of these people's stories. But essentially we're designed to actually connect one-on-one. Mother Teresa says that if I look at the mass, I will never act. If I look at one, I will. So in my work with nonprofit organizations, this can be a challenge because especially when it comes to making a video, which is, an investment for the next 5 years for a lot of nonprofits. It's, well, who do we include? And there's this board member, and this volunteer, and then this staff member, and then this client, and then all of a sudden you have a 10-minute video with 20 different talking heads, and we've lost a story. So what I encourage people to do is think about who are the people whose stories you could tell that allow your audience to care about that person, and therefore care about your work as a result of caring about that person. So I'm going to show one more example, and we can talk a little bit about it afterwards.
I'm moving moss rock to be able to build these beds. To be trying to do the impossible, all you need is good teamwork. title is, an edible landscaper.
Eat Grub is another way to say that we want to give food back to the people.
For every 3 gardens that we build at full price, we subsidize one to a low-income family. I lived here in Oakland South too, and when I turned 4, my dad was deported. They dropped him to the floor, they handcuffed him in front of me, and he rolled down the window as he could, and he was like, I'm gonna go for a while, but I'll be back. And after that, I never saw my daddy. My mom, struggled with 2 jobs on her hands, trying to feed 3 kids. I would come home to $20 on the table. We'd walk to McDonald's, Kentucky Fried Chicken, Jack in the Box.
Growing up is kind of like the only choice we had. We reduced the prices so low that people rather get fast food than actually go buy fresh produce.
We met in high school, 9th grade.
We've just been best friends ever since.
In 2010, my mom was deported. She called me saying, Mijo, they got me. Like, I'm being deported. And like in my mind, I was like, dang, like, this can't be true. Like, Julio noticed that I wasn't going to school anymore because I was trying to like, get money to feed my sister. It was hard, because I mean, like, he came instead of like my uncle coming or someone else coming to like check up on me. Basically teaching yourself how to cook, clean, and do all these things that, someone else is supposed to teach you. So I was like, I'm gonna be doing this for a while, might as well learn how to do it right. Our idea was to inspire young adults, young teenagers, to grow their own food in their own backyard. So each one is like a 12-year-old person. The work is hard, but it pays off just knowing that you're like providing somebody else with nutritious food.
I decided, you know what, I want to change this. I want to teach my peers and peeps all about what organic is. I like kale, broccoli, cauliflower, and apples.
Carrots, radishes, corn, lettuce.
It feels awesome. It's like I'm a whole different person.
I don't want anybody else to go through what I went through. I just go out there and like I have a smile on my face and I be like, you can do it. If you're just looking at me and my friend Julio right here next to me and we're 19 and we're doing it.
So, Salad Julio, we met at our annual fundraiser that we do, and it's a place where we invite organizations that might not have the resources to create a professional video to come pitch a story. So there's 5 presenters, and they pitch for 3 minutes each. And a lot of people put a lot of effort into their presentations because it's a unique opportunity. And so I heard about Salad Julio, and I invited them to be speakers, and all the other presenters came, dressed up and with fancy PowerPoints and ready to go in 3 minutes. And Salad Julio came with one fuzzy picture and wearing sweatshirts and jeans. And then Sal came up to me and he's like, what should I say? And I said, just tell your story. And he did, and that night they were the near unanimous winner, which I think speaks to the power of an authentic story and characters. And in the case of Planting Justice, which is the organization, the umbrella organization that they work for, there were so many interesting stories there. There was the founder story, there were stories of other people who worked on these gardens who've been inmates previously, and so it can be tempting to try to do a lot, but it's the whittling down into getting to know 1 to probably not more than 3 people in a 3 to 5 minute video that has more impact in my experience. So you want to ask, who is the most memorable person to tell your story? So in print, I want to give you a sense of how this can contrast to the usual way that we often tell our stories, which is through our mission statements, or we think we're telling our story. So here's Mama Hope's mission statement. Mama Hope is a nonprofit organization focused on building self-sufficient communities in sub-Saharan Africa. Sums up what they do pretty well. Does anyone volunteer to read Planning Justice? Okay.
Planning Justice democratizes access to affordable and nutritious food by empowering disenfranchised urban residents with the skills, resources, and inspiration to maximize food production, economic opportunities, and environmental sustainability.
Okay, how many of you started to fall asleep about halfway through that? Right? So, by contrast, here's another way to talk about your organization, or their organization. The San Francisco woman dedicates her life to serving communities in Africa after the tragic loss of her mother creates unexpected and now unbreakable ties to Kenya. Right? Makes you want to lean in, learn a little bit more. 2 Oakland teens turn their lives and eating habits around through a one-of-a-kind urban garden program providing access to food and opportunities they've never had. So when clients I work with are nervous about just telling one person's story, I invite them to think about both a micro story and a macro story. So again, when you're working in print, you're writing a grant, you have to get those details in there. There's still a way to tell a character-driven story. So the micro story is the story of this bird, right? So we get to know this bird. We get to know Nyla. We get to know Sal and Julio. And in the context of that, you saw it more with the Mama Hope story. There was her story, right, which is the micro story. And so you get to have the emotional experience through the micro story. And then woven in there, you also have the macro story. You get to see the big picture. But what often happens in storytelling is that we feel so obliged to give the macro story. Well, this is our vision, this is what we're trying to do, and these are the program details, that the micro story gets lost. So I like to prioritize the micro story and weave in the macro story. So prioritize the bird and also weave in the bird's eye view. So when it comes to characters, there's 4 characteristics. I came up with this acronym. You're looking for people who are genuine, who can be vulnerable. Vulnerability is what allows us to connect on the deepest levels. People who can be outgoing. In the TV news world, there was always those people who would run up like, put me on TV, put me on TV. And invariably, they were always the best people on camera because they just have that kind of quality. People who are articulate. So sometimes people have a really great story, but they're super shy or soft-spoken, and it just doesn't translate. On the other hand, sometimes people have maybe a more mediocre story, but they're a really good spokesperson for it. And then, someone who's just lively. And I have an example of that. My last little video example I'm going to show you today of these 4 characteristics.
I'm running not just for me, I'm running for all the homeless people. Let me start now. I just got to be strong for them. Be strong for my mother. Be strong for myself. That's all I got.
Kindness is a high five. Nice pace, keep going. Oh man, nothing. That would have been a sweet one. Beautiful. It's a spark of energy that you're transferring from yourself to another. And who doesn't want a high five? Hey, how do you guys have high fives today? Yeah, all right.
I was concerned about if people don't have food, it would be bad for them, and we all want life to be good for people. It feels great just because it feels great to help a lot of people that didn't have food.
My friend that went out with me the first time, she was just like, I could never do that. Hi. This is an enlarged photograph of my smile.
There's only a big sign, T. Smile.
This is my car. And I have a big smile on the front and the back. Hi. Okay, so that's my example of lively. It pretty much speaks for itself. You can can find that woman still roaming the streets of Mission in San Francisco, in case you're curious. So, working with characters, there's a few more tips I wanted to share about how I try to bring out the best in characters. And that is, firstly, putting them in an environment that they feel comfortable in. So, in the example of Claire's story, we had actually done a sit-down interview with her with the light and all the fancy stuff. But it wasn't until we got her out on the street that we saw her really come alive. And that's when she's laughing and she's interacting with people, and she feels comfortable because it's her environment. So, I often like to put people in a place where, they might be painting a picture or doing a hobby of some sort that they're already accustomed to doing, so they're less likely to pay attention to the fact that they're being interviewed or recorded in some way. If you're working for radio or video, using a lavalier microphone, so it's not like putting this obvious microphone in someone's face. Again, going back to that idea of people being stifled when they feel like they're being recorded, rather than having a moment when the interview begins of like, okay, now we're in the interview, or lights, camera, action type thing. I work with the videographer to just have my shoulder tapped when I know that he's ready, so that I'm already engaging this person, talking about where they grew up and various details about what they did last weekend, and then we're just sort of seamlessly going into what becomes the interview, but to them hopefully still feels like a conversation. And then the last thing is, people work differently with this, but I believe strongly in having a noteless type conversation. Again, creating that conversational feel. I find that when you're sitting there and you've got your points, and people see this long list, they're like, oh God, what are we going to talk about for 30 minutes? And so, of course, I have a plan. I have bullet points in my head. I know where we're going. And then I tuck that piece of paper away, and I don't bring it out perhaps until the end, after the interview's over, to make sure that we've hit on the points that we had planned to. So, very briefly, just like to give you about 30 seconds to reflect on a character. Maybe the character is yourself. Maybe the character is a client of your organization or nonprofit. So who are the characters that you think could effectively tell this story that you want to tell? So I'm going to move on with the principle number 3 and number 4 pretty quickly. And then I'm going to give you a chance to share some of the stories that you've been crafting with each other. And then we'll wrap up after that. So principle number 3 quickly is remember structure, and when you can, build to a surprise. So what's her name? Isha. I thought she did a really great job of structure. So she started this out with she always wanted a pet, and then she talked about the stray cat, and I was like, maybe it's a story about a stray cat. And then, there's the whole scratching thing. I thought maybe someone's going to wake up with scratches all over their face. And then there was the whole element of the pet being given away, and that was a surprise. I didn't expect that. So when you can throw some sort of unexpected element of surprise in a story, it just has a way to stick. In a way that nothing else does. So, in the span of your lifetime, how many of you have ever had a surprise birthday party? Right? It's probably one of the few that you actually really remember because you were surprised. So, Steven Spielberg says that people have forgotten how to tell stories. Stories don't have a middle or end anymore. They usually have a beginning that never stops beginning. Okay? So here's the talking head example, right? It's like, okay, we get to know this nonprofit. And there's this talking head, this talking head, this talking head, and we have no story there. We just have this endless beginning. So here's a common structure. There are very varied story structures that you can explore, but a common one, identify a problem, introduce a hero, send that hero out into the world, resolve tension, draw to a conclusion. So you want to think about how your story structure can allow the surprise to have a maximum impact. So Isha gave a great example of this, right? She didn't just say, like, I had this pet and my parents gave it away. You know, she offered all these details that kind of took you on this journey. There's this great analogy in boxing that applies to storytelling, which is like, right at the beginning you want to hook them, and then you're doing this bob and weave, and then in the end there's some kind of jab that makes for a memorable, surprising ending. So here's an example off the video format that I stumbled across in my neighborhood. That's an example of storytelling that I think has emotion, character, and a structure. So people think only smokers die from lung cancer. Jill proved them wrong, right? There's emotion, there's Jill, there's a beginning, middle, and end. So the last principle I'm going to touch briefly on, I'll give you a moment to reflect on principle number 3 and 4 in the interest of time. This is kind of a bonus in your stories. So we're all looking for stories to find some meaning, to take a message from. So Jonas Sachs, who runs Free Range Studios in the East Bay, talks about how stories that work tend to be about reluctant or unlikely heroes lured into a dangerous quest of self-discovery. Hearing these stories excites and entertains us on a conscious level, but they also subtly influence our very conception of what is possible in our real lives, because each of us is a hero in our own personal myth. So the idea here is that we are, in addition to wanting to see ourselves in these stories, we're wanting to aspire to something through these stories. New brain research shows that as people watch and consume stories, their brain goes through a very similar process of the protagonist, the hero of the story, such that if we encounter a similar situation that the hero encountered, we're more likely to respond like that hero, having watched the story. So you want to ask, what are the universal human values that your story conveys? What is the message that your story conveys? So here's 2 examples in the pieces that we saw. Mama Hope, I don't know if this part stuck out for you, but if you've ever lost someone or have had anything difficult happen, this may resonate. Grief is just love. You can take your grief, that love, and make something of it. You're able to honor that person and let them live on. Something we can all resonate with, right? Planting justice, I just go out there and have a smile on my face and say, you can do it. If you're looking at me and my friend Julio, we're 19 and we're doing it. Both these stories are examples of people who've taken their life's pain and turned it into their life mission. And to your point, there's a lot of darkness in each of their stories, but you have to kind of go into that to understand the light. And it's the light that we all are looking for, but we have to understand and connect to the dark side first. So, quick little tips on how I try to get the message out of people when I'm interviewing them. Just simply asking the question, like, what did you learn from all of this? There's always the details, but just asking the simple question, what did you learn from all of this, can evoke that message. What would you tell someone who might be in a similar position? Right, what advice would you give them? Can help elicit the message. And then just reflecting back, what inspires me about your story is this. And reflecting that message, what you see, and then inviting them to respond as well as to why they are inspiring, why their vision, their message is inspiring. So I'm going to give you another minute to just reflect on structure and message for the story that you've been working on. And then after that minute, I'm going to bring you up and have you briefly share with your partner. Take a minute before breaking up. I'm going to give you about 3 minutes each to share the story and get feedback from the person. It'll probably be closer to 4 minutes each. So perhaps turn to a different person this time. You can make that happen. And the first person's going to try to share your story in about 2 to 3 minutes and get about a minute of feedback from the person. Based on the principles that we've learned, how effective is this story? So person number 1. I'll tell you when to switch. Ross from Adobe coming in to talk to you about an exciting new storytelling application after me. So I'm going to talk briefly about storytelling and fundraising, and this really interesting study from across, it was done at Carnegie Mellon. So it was a study that was done on a college campus where students were given 2 different sets of information, or stories, and they, as a result of taking a survey, they were invited to donate the $5 that they made from taking the survey to one or the other cause. And so one cause was described this way, that in one African country, 3.2 million stand on the brink of starvation, 2.4 million have no easy access to clean water, almost 4 million need emergency shelter. So pretty compelling statistics. And the other one, they were introduced to this 7-year-old girl named Rokia from Mali, Africa, desperately poor, facing the threat of severe hunger, starvation. With your support, Save the Children will work with Rokia's family and other members of the community to help feed her, provide her with education, as well as basic medical care and hygiene education. So, as students are encountering these 2 different messages, where do you think that most of the donations went? I'm sorry? So many voices. Rokia's story, right? So, not surprisingly, most people donated to Rokia. But what I think is more surprising is that there was a 3rd category of information that was shared. And this category had a combination of the statistics and Rokia's story. Which do you think was most powerful? So, perhaps surprisingly, Rokia's story was still the most donated to. So this speaks to the power of your story, that we can get scared of sticking to one story sometimes, but it can have so much power, as evidenced here. Brene Brown, who talks a lot about vulnerability, describes stories as data with soul. So if you're arguing with your executive director, we need the statistics, you can bring this quote along. So the last few points I wanted to share just about medium. So I think certain kinds of information are best shared through certain mediums. So when you're dealing with print, statistics are great for print, facts, program details. These things are not so great for video. So video is a visual medium. It should be saved for visual content, not just the talking head and the white background. Video is an emotional medium. You can convey direct human emotion. And I like to think of emotion and motion as sort of the guidelines here. So with video, you don't want just visual content, you want very active visual content. So the shots of people hammering that Habitat for Humanity house, etc. So another just quick point I wanted to share is that before I ever start to tell you one story, I ask a set of questions that might be helpful to you as you're starting to tell a story, because these stories that we choose to tell can change based on the answers to these questions. So, number 1, who is your audience? Sometimes we forget to ask that question. Number 2, what is your message? Number 3, what do you want them to do as a result of listening to, watching, reading this story? All of these can be factors in determining which story you choose to tell. Last 3 points I want to make to our 140 character friend. Here's a great quote for you. Keep it short. So perfection is finally attained, not when there is no longer anything to add, which is usually the mindset we're in, but when there's no longer anything to take away. So I like to think of storytelling as not an addition process, it's a stripping away process. And as you strip away, you get to the essence of what you're trying to convey. The other thing to remember is that everyone has a story. There's this guy, Steve Hartman, who still works for CBS News, and at one point had this amazing job. His segment was called Assignment, or actually his former segment was called Everyone Has a Story. What he used to do was take a dart and throw it on the wall where there was a map, and he would go to wherever that dart landed, and he would, this was back when there were phone books, he would go to a phone booth in this town, and he would randomly find a name, and he would show up at that person's door, and he found the most amazing stories. of everyday people who had stories that they didn't think they had, that he was so skillfully able to draw out of them. And the last point is that the world needs the stories that you have to tell. Someone out there needs to hear the story that you have to tell. Marco Margolis says that if you want to learn about a culture, listen to the stories. If you want to change the culture, change the story. So all of the stories that you have, that you're sitting on with your papers there, all the stories that you have in this room can be a part of creating a cultural shift when shared out in the world, which I hope you'll be inspired to do as a result of spending some time here this afternoon. So thank you all for being here. And my contact information is here. Laura in the back is our project manager for Storytellers for Good. And she can tell you about these workshops that we do, about our video services. We have a one-day storytelling training coming up. It's going to be at the Hub in San Francisco on August 15th. So we can let you know about that if you'd like. And yeah, I think Brian's in the back. In the interest of time, I'm happy to stay for questions, but I know that we are cut short a little bit today. So I want to let you guys have a break before the next presenter comes in.